I was 17 when they said it, and I left with one suitcase and the quiet understanding that love had conditions I didn't meet. My sister kept the house, the stories, the version of me they preferred. I kept my name clean, my records cleaner, and a memory that never raised its voice. Years passed. I built a life that looked unremarkable from the outside. Degrees, contracts, patience. I learned how power moves when it isn't shouting, how paper can bruise, how timing can be mercy or a blade. When my parents resurfaced, it was with smiles and apologies shaped like invitations. They didn't know I'd already forgiven them in the only way that matters, by making sure I never needed their approval again. So when I walked down the aisle, calm as glass, they finally saw me. And that's when the signatures started to matter. Want to know why? I grew up in a house where silence was considered good manners. We didn't shout, we didn't slam doors. We folded our disagreements into neat stacks and pretended they weren't heavy. My parents called it being civilized. I learned early that it mostly meant not asking for things twice. Twice. My sister Mara understood this better than anyone. She was 3 years older, effortlessly charming, the kind of person who could turn complaints into jokes and still get her way. Teachers loved her. Neighbors trusted her. My parents relaxed around her in a way they never did with me, as if she were proof they'd done something right. I was the steady one, the reliable one. I did my chores without reminders, kept my grades high, stayed out of trouble. When something went missing, no one accused me, but no one looked relieved either. I existed in the margins, useful and quiet, like a note taped to the fridge. Daily life followed a rhythm that rarely changed. My mother woke before dawn to make coffee. She barely drank. My father read the paper at the table, turning pages with a deliberate slowness that discouraged conversation. Mara floated in late hair, still damp, already telling a story about someone else's mistake. I listened. I always listened. It was easier than explaining myself. The first crack appeared over something small. It always is. A college fund spreadsheet left open on the family computer. 2 columns, 2 names, one amount that made sense, another that didn't. When I asked calmly if there'd been a mistake, my mother closed the laptop and said, "We'd talk later, till later." We never did. After that, things began to tilt. Responsibilities that used to be shared became mine alone. Expectations hardened. If Mara missed a deadline, it was stress. If I did, it was attitude. I learned to double-check everything, emails, receipts, conversations, because my version of events started arriving already questioned. I worked part-time after school and handed over most of my pay to help. Mara quit her job to focus. When I mentioned the difference, my father sighed and said families weren't courts of law. I nodded because nodding kept the peace. The betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated. A lie I didn't correct because correcting it would embarrass someone. A decision made without me, explained later as a necessity. My name used to smooth over a problem I didn't create. Each time I told myself it wasn't personal. Each time it felt more specific. The night it finally broke, the house was unusually quiet. Mara stood in the doorway to my room, arms folded, not unkind, just resolved. She said my parents were upset. She said things would be easier if I stayed somewhere else for a while. When my parents repeated it, carefully together, the words sounded rehearsed. I remember the suitcase on my bed, half packed, and the way no one met my eyes. That was when I understood. This wasn't temporary, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. I moved out 2 days later with a borrowed car and a mattress tied down with rope. No one cried. My mother pressed a small envelope into my hand. Cash counted neatly, and told me to call if I needed anything. My father hugged me the way you hug someone you might not see again, brief and careful, as if we were coworkers ending a contract. Mara watched from the porch, expression neutral, already finished with the moment. I rented a room from a woman named Denise who smelled like laundry soap and asked no questions. The room was barely wide enough for the mattress, but it had a lock, which felt luxurious, more hours. I learned which groceries stretch the farthest. I learned how quiet a life can get when no one is waiting for you to explain yourself. At first, my parents checked in, short calls, polite concern. They asked if I was settled. They didn't ask where I was living. Mara never called at all. I told myself this was adulthood arriving early, that independence always feels like abandonment at first. I said it enough times that it almost sounded true. School became my anchor. I stayed late in the library, took extra shifts, applied for scholarships with a precision that surprised even me. I didn't talk about my family. When people asked, I said we were a complicated, which felt accurate without being vulnerable. I learned how to sound composed even when something inside me was still negotiating terms. Then small things started to reach me out of order. A bill forwarded to my email by mistake. A package returned because the sender no longer lived at this address. My name was still useful, apparently, just not present. I asked my mother about it once, and she sounded tired and said it was easier this way. Easier than what? She didn't say. I saw Mara once, months later, at a grocery store near campus. She looked surprised, then pleased, as if I were a memory she'd assumed resolved itself. She asked how I was, the way people do when they don't want details. I said fine. She nodded, relieved, and told me she'd moved into my old room, painted it, made it hers. I smiled because that was the last thing she could take without asking. The call stopped after that. Not abruptly, just fewer than none. Holidays passed quietly. I learned to sit with absence without narrating it. I stopped expecting explanations. What replaced them was clarity. Not the dramatic kind, just a steady understanding of where I stood and how carefully that position had been managed. By my second year on my own, I was no longer surviving. I was building, credits accumulated, references stacked. I kept copies of everything, a habit I told myself was professional, not personal. When I signed my first real contract, I didn't tell anyone. I took myself out for coffee and sat with the feeling until it settled. Settled. The last time I heard my parents' voices before years of silence was through a voicemail I didn't answer. My mother said they missed me. My father added that families go through phases. I saved the message, not out of sentiment, but because I learned that words, once given, can matter later. Time passed in a way that felt intentional. I chose my days carefully. Work, classes, routines that rewarded consistency. I learned the language of offices and meetings, how to speak with confidence without revealing anything unnecessary. People began to rely on me. I noticed how trust grows when you do exactly what you say you will, every time. I finished school quietly. No graduation party, no family in the crowd, just a rented cap, a handshake, and my name printed correctly for once. I framed the diploma myself and hung it where I could see it every morning, not as proof of success, but as a reminder of how much can be built without permission. I changed addresses twice. My parents never asked where I was. When I changed my last name back to my grandmother's, legally, cleanly, it felt less like an erasure and more like alignment. I wasn't hiding. I was organizing. Work brought me into rooms where decisions happened slowly and documentation mattered more than charm. I listened more than I spoke. I took notes. I learned which questions sounded innocent and which ones made people defensive. I watched how consequences were rarely loud and almost always avoidable. If you knew where to look, news from home arrived indirectly. A mutual acquaintance mentioned Mara had married young, then divorced faster. Another said my parents were thinking about downsizing. I absorbed these facts the way you absorb weather reports, without reaction, just awareness. I never reached out. I never needed to. Years after I left, my mother found my email. She wrote as if we'd spoken last week. She said they'd been worried. She said Mara had gone through a phase. She said it might be nice to reconnect carefully on neutral ground. I read the message twice before replying with a single sentence. I hope you're all well. It wasn't forgiveness. It was accuracy. After that, the tone changed. Invitations replaced apologies. I was asked to visit, to explain myself, to let things be put back in place. I declined politely, citing schedules that were conveniently full. My life had weight now. It resisted rearrangement. When I met my partner, it felt uncomplicated in a way I hadn't known to expect. No interrogations, no comparisons. He noticed details, remembered them, never used them as leverage. When he asked about my family, I told him the truth without sharpening it. He didn't ask me to soften it either. Planning the wedding brought logistics I handled with the same care I handled contracts. Guest list, seating, names spelled correctly. When my parents' RSVP arrived, accepted both of them, I felt nothing immediately. That came later in a quiet moment when I realized how confident they sounded. how certain they were that time had done the work for them. Mara's response came last. One line, wouldn't miss it. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then added her name where it belonged. Not out of kindness, out of completeness. The week before the wedding, an envelope arrived with my parents' handwriting. Inside was a note about family, about fresh starts, about how proud they were. Tucked beneath it was something else, something official, something they clearly believed would make me grateful. I set it on the table and let it sit there, unopened, while the house filled with quiet. I opened the envelope that night, not because I was curious, but because curiosity had finally lost its edge. Inside was paperwork, formal, stamped, carefully clipped, a gesture disguised as generosity. A correction in their minds. I read every line slowly, the way I read contracts, noting what was said and, more importantly, what wasn't. When I finished, I put everything back exactly as I'd found it and slid the envelope into a folder already labeled. The days leading up to the wedding were full in a way that left little room for reflection. Vendors confirmed times. Friends dropped by with lists and laughter. My partner moved through the house with an easy calm that steadied me. He never asked if I was nervous. He knew the difference between anticipation and something older. The night before, I slept deeply, no dreams, just rest. The venue was quiet when I arrived the next morning, sunlight stretching across the floor like it belonged there. Whoa. I walked through the space alone once, touching nothing, imagining everything exactly as it was about to be. Order has a sound when it settles. I could hear it. My parents arrived early. They looked pleased, almost relieved, as if attendance itself had rewritten history. My mother hugged me longer than necessary. My father told me I looked successful. Mara came last, dressed impeccably, eyes already scanning the room. She smiled when she saw me, a practiced curve that assumed we were aligned. Throughout the morning, they tried to place themselves near me, near decisions, near moments that felt symbolic. I let them. There's a kind of calm that comes from knowing where the lines are drawn, even if no one else can see them. When it was time, I stood at the back, bouquet steady in my hands. Anya. The music began. I felt the weight of the room, the attention, the neat rows of people who believed they understood what they were witnessing. I met my father's eyes once. He nodded, satisfied. As I walked forward, I noticed how still everything felt. Not tense, just settled. Every document signed. Every choice accounted for. The kind of quiet that comes after preparation, not before consequence. I reached the front and took my place. My partner smiled, unaware of nothing, aware of me. When I turned slightly, I saw my family together in the front row, expectant, comfortable, certain. That certainty was the last thing they had left.